In the winter of 1943, two rooms disagreed about whether an airplane could exist. In one, engineers in Washington told a visiting general that what he was describing couldn't be built. In the other, a hangar outside Brisbane, it had already flown, built from machine guns cut out of wrecked fighters and bolted into a bomber's nose where a bombardier used to sit. The man who built it had a wife and 4 children, roughly 2,500 miles north of that hangar, behind wire in Manila. Every hour he spent on that airplane was an hour he wasn't spending on them. What he built met a Japanese convoy in March of 1943, and in 3 days, put 12 ships on the seabed. Within a year, it had made him the single most valuable man in the 5th Air Force. That is exactly what it ended up costing him. By the autumn of 1942, the 5th Air Force had a problem it could state precisely and couldn't solve. Its bombers could find the Japanese convoys running men and supplies down to New Guinea. They couldn't hit them. A ship under attack turns, and a bomb dropped from 8,000 feet takes long enough to fall that the target isn't underneath it anymore. The B-25 carried a glass nose, a bombardier, and a bomb sight built for factories and rail yards, targets that stay where you leave them. The failure got written down after every mission. Empty bomb plots, crews lost, ships still moving. An Air Force that can't stop reinforcements loses the ground underneath it. The answer wasn't in an engineering department. It was in a hangar in the hands of a man who wasn't supposed to be there. George Kenney took over Allied Air Forces in the Southwest Pacific in August 1942, and one of the first things he did was walk the flight lines. At Charters Towers in Queensland, he stopped at an A-20 with its nose stripped open. A middle-aged officer was fitting .50 caliber machine guns into the space, using weapons salvaged out of fighters that had already been written off as wrecks. Kenney didn't discipline him. He took him. The man became Special Projects Officer on the general's personal staff. His name was Paul Irvin Gunn, and the younger pilots called him Pappy. Since the 20th of January that year, his wife Polly and their 4 children had been held inside the University of Santo Tomas in Manila, interned with several thousand other Allied civilians. He was the only man in the theater who could build what Kenney wanted. That was about to become the problem. Gunn was a mechanic before he was a pilot and never stopped being one. He'd enlisted in the Navy at the tail end of the First World War, learned engines first and flying afterward, qualified as an enlisted naval aviator, instructed at Pensacola, and retired a chief petty officer in December 1939 with about 21 years behind him. Then he went to Manila, flew for a businessman, and ended up chief pilot and operations manager of Philippine Airlines, which began carrying passengers in March 1941. 9 months later, the war came for the airline. He moved its Beechcrafts to a decommissioned strip at Grace Park in Caloocan and parked them beside the graves at La Loma Cemetery, betting, the story goes, that an enemy pilot would hesitate before shooting up a graveyard. He flew medical supplies into Bataan in an unarmed, unarmored airplane and was decorated for it. He kept flying until a Japanese patrol plane caught him over Morro Gulf and put him down in a coconut plantation, where the owner, a man who had once bought a ticket from him in peacetime, pulled him out of the wreck. Then he went back, and back. An untold number of flights into the islands to lift out stranded pilots and mechanics, most of them authorized by nobody. He'd already learned that the only survivable altitude was no altitude at all. The modification was simple to describe and expensive to accept. Gunn took the glass nose off the B-25, took the bombardier's station out with it, and filled the space with fixed .50 caliber machine guns, firing straight ahead, aimed by pointing the entire airplane. He hung more guns in packages on the fuselage sides. Where he couldn't get guns, he took them off airframes that had already crashed. Then he cleared the aircraft to attack at masthead height, level with the deck of the ship it was shooting at. Every part of that was a trade. Removing the bombardier removed a crewman, a bomb sight, and the whole idea of hitting something from a safe distance. What replaced it was volume, a wall of fire that could sweep a deck clear of gun crews in the seconds before the bombs went in. It only worked from a few hundred yards at wave height, flying directly into the ship's own anti-aircraft batteries with no second pass available. A medium bomber had been designed to keep its crew alive with altitude. Gunn had just spent the altitude. Washington's engineers weren't being obstructive. The blast damage was real. Early test firing peeled the skin off the fuselage and the inner engine nacelles until the blast tubes were run out past the propeller arc. A factory can't ship an airplane that wounds itself every time the pilot presses the trigger. A field workshop can, because a field workshop can repair it again on Tuesday. Ed Larner's crews in the 90th Bomb Squadron were the ones who'd have to fly it. Minimum altitude wasn't a tactic to them. It was a measurement of how close they'd be to the men shooting back. And every problem Gunn solved made him more valuable to the 5th Air Force. Every increase in his value moved him further from the one building in Manila he was trying to reach. He'd spent a year taking runs at a locked door, and the better he got at his job, the further back they stood him from it. If you're finding this one worth your time, a like and a subscribe genuinely help. Stay with it. The part of this story that never made it onto the memorial plaque is still ahead, and it turns on a single order that was written about one man by name. The first converted Mitchell was called Pappy's Folly by the ground crew after an attempt to get it airborne that didn't work. The name was chosen before anybody knew whether it was an insult or a joke. The first full conversion, a B-25C with the serial 41-12946, was delivered to Charters Towers on the 8th of December 1942, and it carried a woman's name on the nose, Margaret. By early February 1943, the entire 90th Bomb Squadron was operational on strafers. Then they waited. A squadron of rebuilt bombers sitting in New Guinea with nothing yet to shoot at is a very quiet thing. On the 1st of March 1943, reconnaissance found them something. Between the 2nd and the 4th of March in the Bismarck Sea, Allied aircraft caught a Japanese convoy carrying reinforcements to Leh. All 8 transports went down. 4 of the destroyers went with them. Of roughly 6,900 troops who set out, about 1,200 reached New Guinea. Around 3,000 men died in the water and on the ships. 13 Allied airmen were lost. Japan never again risked a large convoy into waters covered by American aircraft. The attack was so tightly compressed that post-mission intelligence couldn't establish which aircraft had sunk which ship. Nobody could hand out the credit cleanly. And in Washington, months after the airplane had already fought and won, engineers were still explaining that a factory-built version of it wasn't possible. There is a harder fact in the record, and it belongs here. For days afterward, Allied aircraft strafed survivors in the water. Gunn wasn't in the room where that was decided. It was still done with the guns he put there. The door in Manila was no closer than it had been the year before. The invention had outgrown the inventor. That was the beginning of the second half of his war. The turning came in 5 stages, and only one of them involved the enemy. The first stage was industrial. General Arnold wanted Gunn brought back to the United States to work with engineers at Wright Field. Kenney refused to give him up permanently and negotiated a loan, a temporary trip to Ohio and to the North American plant, where Gunn showed the company how to do in a factory what he'd been doing with salvage. The result was eventually the B-25J, carrying 12 forward-firing guns and as many as 14 when the turret was synchronized to fire ahead. The field fix became a production line. The second stage was institutional. He was no longer a man with an idea. He was an asset, allocated between commands, argued over by generals. The third stage was personal. He kept flying anyway. He tested the 75mm cannon installation in combat. He was put in charge of a battalion of mechanics and engineers that went ashore behind the Leyte landings to build a forward airfield. On an unlit strip at Tacloban, with Navy pilots overhead who had no carrier left to land on, he stood on the runway with a pair of flashlights and brought them down using the signals he'd learned as a naval aviator 20 years earlier. He was no longer the only man who could build the airplane. By late 1944, he wasn't even needed to explain it. The fourth stage was administrative, and it's the one that matters. Kenney had watched his Special Projects officer for 2 years and reached a conclusion about him, that if the 5th Air Force got close enough to Luzon, Gunn would go after his family himself, alone, in whatever aircraft was nearest. So Guinea issued an order that Gunn was not to be allowed inside an airplane, an order typed about one man by name because his own commander no longer trusted him near a set of controls. The fifth stage was physical. A white phosphorus bomb fell on the airfield at Tacloban and a fragment lodged in his shoulder. The arm was left useless. He was evacuated to Australia and stayed in a hospital bed through the winter, listening to formations he'd designed passing overhead on their way north. On the 3rd of February, 1945, the gate at Santo Tomas came down. He wasn't standing in front of it. MacArthur had ordered a flying column of the 1st Cavalry Division into Manila ahead of the main advance to reach the camp. Colonel Dave Hutchinson of the 308th Bombardment Wing went in with them, specifically to find the Gunn family. They were alive. They were also close to starvation after 3 years and 2 weeks inside. MacArthur visited the camp about 2 weeks later. Where the family and the father finally saw each other is contested. One account has them flown south to his hospital bed in Australia. Another has the reunion in Manila that same year. The record disagrees with itself, which is fitting, because the largest thing in this story is a correction. There was no rescue. The best-known modern account of his life carries a subtitle promising a rescue mission that changed the course of the war. Historians reviewing it have pointed out flatly that no such mission existed. Gunn spent 3 years unable to help the people he was closest to, and what freed them in the end was the Allied advance, not the man who had been trying to engineer his way north since 1942. The airplane he built shortened that advance. It did not open that gate. He was retired from the Army as a colonel on the 30th of June, 1948 on physical disability. He went back to Philippine Airlines, then set up his own charter operation, hauling cargo and passengers around the islands he'd flown across when they were occupied. On the night of the 11th of October, 1957, he was flying a Beech 18 through the central Philippines when a downforce drove the aircraft into the ground. He got it briefly airborne again, a man with 20,000 hours doing the only thing left to do, and then struck a tree. Everyone on board was killed. His obituary got 2 things wrong. It said he'd flown MacArthur out of Bataan. It said he'd been shot down 6 times. Kenny, writing about him 2 years later, had already explained how that happens. His deeds were real. His stories were often fantasies. He's buried at Barrancas National Cemetery, at the Naval Air Station in Pensacola, on the base where he once taught other people to fly. His map case sits behind glass at the MacArthur Memorial in Norfolk, a folder of routes belonging to a man who never found the one he wanted. Arkansas put him in its Aviation Hall of Fame in 2008. Philippine Airlines still flies. And in museums, solid-nosed Mitchells sit with the gun ports plugged and the ammunition trays empty, described on a card that fits his entire argument into about 40 words. His youngest son spent years afterward writing the book the official record never contained. If you've made it this far, a like and a subscribe help more than you'd think, and I'd like to know where you land on Kenny's order, because reasonable people don't agree about it. He protected an irreplaceable engineer. He also stood between a father and the only thing that man wanted. 2 rooms once disagreed about whether an airplane could exist. The airplane exists. It's behind glass now, with the guns taken out, and nobody stamped his name into the steel.